Welcome to a Bible Talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church.
I want to show you three photos of a couple of churches in India. They are photos of a couple of different gatherings. The first, the one on the left, is a photo of a church in a massive open-air chapel. And the second sort of comes from or two sides of the same church, and this one's a small concrete church that would probably be no bigger than our seminar rooms over here. Now let me ask you, this is not rhetorical, so feel free to ring out. What stands out to you in the photos? What stands out to you? Anything could stand out. Say again? They're sitting, yep, they're sitting. That's pretty helpful. So as in sitting as in on the ground. Yep, okay, that's helpful. Other things? Say that again, Mrs. Brown. Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, if you were to pan across a little bit further on this one, you'll see that the women are on that side and the men are on this side. So there's men in this one. Here, you've sort of got both in some ways. Yeah, what else do you notice? Yes, yeah, absolutely crammed and in lots of different ways. And they usually rush in to be able to get to the front seats, let the reader understand, which is good. Yep. Any other things you notice? They're all sitting in the left-hand one, whereas here we're worshipping and standing in the right. Yep, that's right. The Bibles are open in front of them, on the floor. Anything else? No children? Yeah, that's a good observation, actually. That was not the intention of showing those photos, because usually there are lots of children around. If this one is predominantly men and this one's predominantly women, do you notice anything different between the two? Yeah, women are covering their heads as they clearly are praying. So these ones here are praying, whereas these guys are talking about whatever they're having for lunch that day. On the left-hand side, we'll see how they go. There's quite a few different things there. India is an extraordinary place. Colours are amazing. When in church, the men will sit on the left and the women on the right as you enter into the church. Most of the time, the women will cover their heads in a sign of submission. It's in prayer and it's in song when they will cover their heads. Otherwise, it's not as important otherwise. And this is from a country, India, that is one of the most progressive countries in the world in many ways, particularly when you think about the role of women in society. Indira Gandhi she's probably the most notable instance, as she was Prime Minister from 1966 for 15 years across her two terms. Not including those women who are monarchs, she was the second head of state appointed in the world. And so, they sort of got... you could say that we're all late to the party, but India was probably early to the party in that sense. And for as progressive a country as it is, there is still a sharply drawn distinction between the role of women and men in their society, and that crosses over into the church as well. Now, Australia, particularly in the last couple of decades, has been a place which has championed the promotion of women into high posts, and hopefully there will be more to come. The photos that you see of Christian churches that are situated in regions right around India, these ones are in areas which are populated by mostly Hindu, culturally Hindu people. The women wear the headscarves, and they wear them for two reasons. One, it is the culture for women to show respect by covering their heads before honoured guests. And the second, this is a Christian church, and the Christians there have been taught from the Bible in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, instructing women that when in church they should wear head coverings, otherwise they would be disrespectful to God. And so they've taken that literally, and you see that in pretty much all of the churches you go to, particularly in the south of India. And regarding the men in the photos, you might also notice that they have, you didn't pick this one up, they all have short hair. And again, that's for two reasons. One's very practical. It's generally pretty hot in India, and so wearing long hair can be a bit problematic, particularly for the guys when they're doing some of the manual work that they do. And like the women, 1 Corinthians 11 seems to command them to keep their hair short. Another interesting custom in some parts of India, although it's a little bit hard to see in either of these photos, is that when a man is married, he will often wear a beard, whereas it's unusual for a single man to have a beard. Well, we're going to have a look at 1 Corinthians 11 today. It would be very helpful if you had that open in front of you in some form, tablet, phone, or grab one of the blue Bibles at the back. And you'll see from the Bible reading in a moment that would be a good thing to do, because we're going to be looking at our way through this one. And it looks at a church who have been given instructions in how to order themselves as believers. Not only in the church setting, but in the context of marriage. And it will mention head coverings for women and short hair for men. As we hear it read in a moment, I'm aware that across our church family, we have many women who are not wearing any head coverings. And I'm also aware that across our church we have some men who wear long hair. And so we're going to have a look and see if that's a problem or not, because maybe this will change the culture about how we actually meet together when we gather as a church. So 1 Corinthians chapter 11, let's see what we can learn from this one, and Alan's going to read that for us. Where's Alan?
Thanks for the intro, Ken. I was just saying to Jackie, seeing I'm married, I'm allowed a beard now, apparently. Apparently not. Apparently not. So anyway, there you go. So anyway, it's on page 1150 of the Church Bibles. So let's have a look at this. 1 Corinthians 11, chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting at verse 2. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. But I want you to realise that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonours his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonours her head. It's the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For a woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? But that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God.
Let's see what we can do with this passage and try and understand it. This passage is written by the Apostle Paul. And what you find is that he continues to address issues or concerns that the church in Corinth had maybe written to him about or debate about. And over the last few weeks, we've looked at what Paul has taught the Christian about their freedom. That is, how to live in the world for the gospel in a way that helps others as well as themselves. And that has pushed a few buttons along the way, as it rightly should. Last week, Paul opened a discussion about how to use their Christian freedom when celebrating the Lord's Supper, if you can see at the end of chapter 10. He'll return back to that at the end of chapter 11, which we'll look at next week. But for this week, sandwiched between those two sort of references to the Lord's Supper, which gives you an indication that he's talking about something to do with the church, he issues a commendation rather than a rebuke. And he gives some instructions, which in our context will definitely push some buttons. Assuming you still have chapter 11 open in front of you, look at verse 2. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. Well, we all like to be praised, and this is a good start. It seems like from this passage that Corinthians have done well. And so it's not a rebuke. They're being upheld for what they've been able to put in place. If you were to go over to verse 17, which we look at next week, you'll see that he has no praise for them. So in this case, they're doing something really well. Next week, we'll be able to pick up, and if you're looking for a rebuke, get the rebuke next week. We all like to be praised. And so what you have here is Paul instructing them, commending them for remembering him, for maintaining the patterns or the traditions from which he showed them, and they have done it in a way that Paul had delivered or passed on to them. So they've been able to continue doing what he has left with them to do. And that, for any teacher, is going to be an encouragement, because they'll be able to look back and go, okay, you're following in the footsteps. What might be helpful to notice here is that Paul has changed his tack just a little. He's now focusing on what the church does when they meet together. What he's about to write is not a pattern that he's applying to the wide world that might be outside of the church fellowship. This is for Christians. This is for the church family. And he wants to make sure that they're thinking about that in a helpful way. One of the reasons that we've titled this series How to Go to Church is because we are picking up what Paul says to a particular church family to help them be more effective for the gospel. And so from here in chapter 11 right through to chapter 14, and if you flip across those chapters, you'll notice that there are several aspects of how they gather that are going to be addressed. How they dress, how they conduct the Lord's Supper, how they use their gifts to serve one another, how they love, how they speak and teach. The tradition that is outlined in our section today instructs men and women on how they should dress for church, and in particular how they should wear their hair, if they have any. Now, before we push further into the passage, and you'll understand why I'm going to go slowly through this one, because I want us to make sure that we are understanding it and working our way through it well. It might be helpful to consider the way it speaks about men and women. Given both genders are mentioned quite a lot in these verses. In the original language, and I'm not going to be quoting Greek at you, don't worry, but in the original language, the word man here can mean both male or husband. And the word here for woman can mean both female or wife. And how do you tell the difference? Well, the context tells you the meaning. It helps you determine the meaning. And that is an important question, for it helps us work out if the passage is speaking to all men and all women, or more particularly, to husbands and wives within the church fellowship. So here, the relationship in view is how those who are married should conduct themselves in the church family. So let me tell you in the middle of our passage today, verses 7 to 12. Paul seems to use Genesis 2 to highlight the marriage relationship. Humanity was made in the image of God. You can see there that's picked up in verse 7, the image and the glory of God. And woman is being taken from man, which we see in Genesis 2. And yet that woman is taken in a way that is beneficial to them both. If you look at verse 9, you'll see it says that the man and the woman were created for each other. And then in verse 11 it says that neither is independent from the other, and gives you this beautiful sort of picture that, in creation you see woman created from man with a rib being taken, but yet every other time after that it's the other way round, because it is always woman that has given birth to man, or woman. And so that relationship is a really interdependent one, and the marriage relationship that's in view here is there to show the order that exists, and the order that he's going to then refer to within the church family. Now, I hope that should help us hear what is being taught, because what it does is it allows us to let go of some of those particularly strong ideas that we have every time we start talking about what this is saying to men generally or women generally, because this is for a very particular church family. It's also to a very particular church family and to those who are married within it. Those who are married have freely chosen one another. And so the call to respect and cherish each other sits behind what is said here. Okay, with that said, let's see if we can understand the argument of how the passage flows. We'll start with the principle, and then we're going to look and see how that's applied in practice. And verse 3 gives you the governing principle. I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. What Paul does here is state the principle. That is, that there is an order of authority in the world that should be visible in the church of God. God the Father is the head of Christ, the Son. Christ is the head of every man, and in this context, Christ is the head of every man, meaning all in the church. And the husband is the head of his wife within that family unit, as described here. So the headship idea here means to have authority over. That is not meant to be an oppressive statement. So, for example, when we think of somebody as the head of a school, the head of school, man or female, as the head of school, they have authority over what happens in the school. And as such, they set the culture and the expectation for all who are involved in the school. That doesn't mean an inequality is at play, but it does mean a responsibility is involved. In our fallen world, the head of the school, whoever that might be, may not get it right. They might not do a brilliant job. But the solution is not to get rid of the role of the head of the school. We still need a good person with authority to ensure the school runs effectively. The principle here is about order, and it will be applied to the church family. It would be heresy to say that God was superior to Christ. Yet in the order of the Godhead, we see Christ submitting himself to his Father. And so it is in the marriage relationship. The husband-wife relationship is placed right alongside the Christ and man relationship and the God and Christ relationship. Appreciate one, you can understand how that will apply in the other. Now, the teaching is not out of character for the Apostle Paul. For in Ephesians 5, that wedding passage that you often hear when you go along to Christian weddings particularly, Paul calls on the husband to love his wife in the same sacrificial way that Christ loved his church. And he speaks of the wife, asking her to be loving and submitting to her husband as she would to her Lord, in the same way that the church is called to submit herself to Christ. You should see that this is a choice in the way that, let me say, to the submissive party, it's a choice for the submissive party here. Christ chooses to submit to the Father, the church chooses to submit to Christ, the wife chooses to submit to not any man, but to one man, her husband. Now, pastorally, we need to be quick to acknowledge that in our fallen world, given that none of us are perfect, and in our fallen marriages, given that our marriages also aren't perfect, submission is a very big ask. And sometimes it's too hard an ask. Both husbands and wives are very good at messing this up. So the principle of verse 3 is a headship principle. And in verse 4 and 5, we see the practice then outlined. So the examples are given are both about how men and women conduct themselves when they are leading the church in prayer and prophesying. We'll leave the discussion about what it means to prophesy till we get to chapter 14. So let's just stick that on ice for the moment. But either way, it's something which is clearly done for the benefit of the church family and probably done in a more formal way or in a way that's been arranged before people. And so to verse 4, words are given to the husband. Verse 5, to the wife. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head, with his scalp covered, dishonours his head, his Lord. Can you see how the word's being used slightly differently there? But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head, her scalp, uncovered, dishonours her head, her husband. It's the same as having her head shaved. Paul says, men, when you pray or prophesy, have your head uncovered because, well, if you veil it, it will dishonour your head, that is Christ. Don't be ashamed that you are standing before the Lord in the way that you are doing what you are doing. In contrast, wives, when you pray or prophesy, have your heads covered because if not, you will dishonour your head, that is, your husband, and in turn Christ. Now I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But notice for the moment, this practice is protecting the principle. It is protecting order and authority under God. So you'll rightly then say, what on earth does head covering have to do with how you pray or prophesy in church? Well, it has to do with the authority you have to stand before others and the way you are then perceived. Anyone, male or female, and notice that this passage has both men and women playing a role in the church family before others. Anyone who is praying or prophesying in the church is leading the church family. Paul wants to ensure that what is being said, or in particular how it's being said, won't bring the message into disrepute. Let me give you a cultural picture from what we know from the first century. Women had no voice, especially in the Jewish synagogue, of which would have been the culture that many of those gathered before or reading this letter would have known. Only men, in particular the rabbi, would have been able to speak to a collected gathering, leaving everyone else to remain silent unless they are called upon. So what you see here, where both women and men are being instructed on how to act when speaking publicly in church, is really quite a novel idea for the context that this was written into. For it was the Christians who gave voice to the people, to both men and women. This perhaps gives us a clue why Paul is being so particular here, because a new custom is really being created, and that is no doubt raising some questions. And further, there was a reason why women covered their heads or put their hair up. It was a sign that they were married. To wear your hair down or uncovered would have been an indication that you are still either a girl, so not of marriable age, or that you are open or available to now be married. Now today, we don't have anything like that. But we do have wedding rings, which operates in a very similar way, a sign that a woman or a man is attached to their husband or their wife. And so when it comes to gathering in this new church in Corinth, not in the synagogue, not what they might have been used to culturally, for a married woman to step up into the role of praying or prophesying, but to do that with her hair uncovered or down, would in the first instance would have been very surprising, but in the second instance be dishonouring, particularly to her husband. And conversely, if the husband was to cover his head or wear his hair long, as in unkempt, then it would be like saying that he was embarrassed or, in that sense, mocking his wife. Either way, what it is that he's trying to do will be discredited before others. Friends, don't get caught up on the legalism that we often get stuck in today when we read passages like this. Yes, a woman or a man should be able to wear his or her hair in whatever way they want today. At least in a way that's going to be culturally appropriate. What this is doing is protecting the message and ensuring that in the way that people react, they are not discrediting, the way that they act, they're not discrediting themselves or their spouse, and therefore discrediting the message of the gospel. So I wear a wedding ring. It tells you that I'm married. It's just a sign. If I take it off, it doesn't mean I'm unmarried. I'm free to wear it when I please. When I wear it, I am saying something, that I am committed to one woman, and for that reason, it's extremely rare that I'll take the ring off. But in my freedom, I can remove it when I like. But there are times when that would be totally appropriate. For example, I had a game of tennis this week. I can't hold my racket properly with my wedding ring on. And so it's appropriate for me to take it off in order to be able to play the game of tennis. There are also times when it would be inappropriate for me to take it off. If I took it off because I was trying to hide that I was married for some particular reason, then that would be dishonouring my wife. Paul's argument in this passage all flows from his desire that when the church meets in prayer or in prophecy, that the message of Christ is not dishonoured by their behaviour, intentionally or not. He's threading the cultural needle here, respecting what was known of the husband and wife relationship, yet accommodating what this new church was able to do, giving everyone a voice in a way that they worship God. You still with me so far? Sorry for doing this slowly and placidly. I just think we need to sort of digest it as we go. So, with this principle in place, he then hands over the church to put the principle into practice. And you can see that in verse 13. So, sorry to jump around the passage, but go right back towards the end. Verse 13, he says, "Judge for yourselves. You work it out. You make the call, for you know the cultural sensitivities. But whatever you do, don't put obstacles in the way of other believers." And then he rattles off some quick-fire challenge questions. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Culturally, the answer is no, probably no. So don't make it an issue. Cover up so that we can pray. Keep on keeping on with what is most important. Verse 14, does not the very nature of the things teach us that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him, but yet if a woman wears her hair long, it's to her glory? Culturally, respectable men wore their hair short and groomed, so be the man. Don't make it an issue. Don't make yourself look like a woman, or perhaps don't shirk your responsibility as a man, or as a husband particularly. And in whatever you decide, and this is helpful for us to hear today, Verse 16, if you want to be contentious about this, if you want to have an issue with this one, well then, let's just stick with what I've actually commanded and said, do this, for that's what all of the churches should do, and that way we don't have to worry about the contention. See the point? Don't let this become an issue amongst you. For I've handed down a practice, it's handed down to the churches of God. If you want to make an issue of it, then just stick with what it is that I've said. If not, remember what the principle is. So, what are we encouraged to do here? What we're encouraged to do here is recognize the principle at play. For the principle is timeless. The principle is as relevant then as it is for us today. It is timeless. In what we do when we meet as a church, we need to do that in a way that does not discredit the gospel. And to be effective, it would be helpful to recognize that there is an order to the authority that is given. And friends, we need to hear this, especially when we assert our individual freedoms or rights in a way that put our preferences before that of others. Being a church family is a collective experience under God. It is not simply an individualistic expression of faith. It's not meant to be an individualistic expression of preferences. We need to be humble before God and humble before others. That should stand us out if we pick up on what Mrs. Connor did as she went through the kids' talk. That should stand us out in a way that is different to the world around. Let the principle govern how we make our decisions. Yet the practice may differ. The practice from whatever it is that we might be referring to may differ, but it will be shaped by the timeless principle. So the practice of this passage will look different from culture to culture. It would be wrong for women in India to pray or prophesy in church with their hair uncovered. Whereas it would not be wrong for women here in Australia to pray or prophesy with their hair uncovered, or indeed even to be able to walk into church. Praise God. Culture to culture will differ. And that also applies to the way you wear your beard, Alan. And the practice of this passage will look different from church to church. This passage will push different buttons, even in our different gatherings, across the 5 different gatherings that are meeting today, who are all hearing this passage. I can tell you that the pressure point's going to come out different at each different congregation, because it's going to push buttons in different ways. Yet what is important is that we all submit to Christ, as the church is called to do that, especially as we gather together here in our Sunday gatherings. And the practice of this passage will look different from married couple to married couple, as indeed those who are married conduct our marriages in different ways, with different roles and different responsibilities in the age that we live today. Yet we are still called to respect and cherish one another in marriage, including the way that we uphold our spouse before others. And the practice of the passage will look different from person to person to person, as we will experience different freedoms, or we want to use our freedoms differently under Christ in the various and different ways. And I'm not talking just about the way we groom our hair, the way that we live out our individual situations. What we should be doing is making sure that our manner and our behaviour does not distract others from meeting or hearing or understanding what Christ has done for us. To give you an example of that, there's a really silly one. When we read through this passage as we're thinking about as a staff team, we then went through all of the Bible readers and all of the gatherings that are meeting today to make sure none of them were male with long hair, simply because we didn't want that person to stand up here and read the Bible and then feel terribly self-conscious about it, and everyone else in the congregation going, that's a bit funny. So it will look different as we apply the principle in practice. And if you're in doubt, if you're thinking, oh, this is all too hard, if you're in doubt and you don't know what it is that you should do, how do I put the principle in practice? We'll just go right back to the very beginning of this chapter. Right back to the very beginning of this chapter, chapter 11, verse 1, Paul says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. If in doubt, follow the example of Christ. I hope that's helpful, and I hope that doesn't introduce too many other things there that all of a sudden we've got a Pandora's box to deal with. Principle, timelessly, is impacted by our practice should always reflect that timeless principle. Let's pray. Lord and Father, passages like this sometimes push our buttons. And we do ask that you help us to put this principle into practice in our settings here, individually, in the marriages that are in this church, in the congregations that make up this church, and in the culture in which we live. And help us to recognise what is most important so we're not putting obstacles before others, when our job is to try and make sure that as we live out what it means to be made in your image, that we might give you the glory. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
You have been listening to a Bible talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church. If you'd like to know more about Jesus, get further information, or download other resources, please visit our website at lmap.org.au.